So they began to spend more than they brought in. The accumulated debt began to weigh down on their economy, and they actually collapsed. Now, the opponents of what we're doing, the opponents of reform, say that it's us as Republicans making up the charges. This chart says our economy is simply going to quit in 2038, exactly like the Soviet Union did. It's going to collapse for the same purpose, that we're spending far more than we're bringing in. We have an accumulated debt. We have an accumulated unrecognized or undiscussed debt that is $202 trillion, and our economy will cease to function. This is coming from the Office of Management and Budget website. This is the White House. They're the ones saying that what we're doing is not sustainable. Now, our friends on the other side of the aisle said that we could do something to cure Social Security. That was, we should pass along a tax increase to those people making above $106,000. It's interesting to hear that when our friends on the other side of the aisle had the House in their control, they had the Senate in their control with a majority that would not allow filibuster, and they had the White House, and they did not once bring up or pass a tax increase for Social Security. I find it amazing that it's so simple now that they're not in charge for them to talk about it, and yet when they were in charge, they couldn't talk about it. The reason that we're facing the problems that we are today with this continuing resolution is that our friends across the aisle did not last year pass a budget and did not pass the appropriating bills, and so they simply passed a continuing resolution, and they could not get that passed through the end of this year. It was within their power to not have this discussion at all on continuing resolution. All they had to do was fund the government through September 30th, and everything would have been fine. We would have had no course to change anything. It's because they passed a bill that would only fund the government through March, through the early part of March, that we're in this situation. So I'm curious, while they say that the solutions are so easy, that they're so necessary, that they didn't find it necessary before December 31st. And in fact, as they're talking about the need to increase taxes, at the other side of the mouth, they actually decreased taxes. They stopped the tax increase that was going to be automatic for American citizens. And so my feeling is that I'm hearing discussions which are not sincere, which they had within their ability to change, but did not. The idea that we are making draconian cuts in our request, the Republican requests for this continuing resolution, you hear that word often, that they're draconian cuts. I always let people decide for themselves. The cuts that we're talking about, we spend $3.5 trillion. The Republicans have suggested cuts at a maximum of $61 billion. And so what would that decrease $3.5 trillion to? I think it's important to assess that in order to decide if the cuts are draconian. Our cuts, $61 billion, take 3.5T down to 3.44. And I always ask people, is that draconian? And I've never heard one person in any town hall say that's draconian. They're in fact alarmed that that's all that either party is able or willing to do about the accumulated debt, about a deficit that is $1.3 trillion, about the inflation that is now rushing our way, and they're saying it is enough, stop it, do something about it. Do a forensic audit of the entire government and begin to defund those things that don't make sense, the things that are no longer effective, the things that are duplicative. We've got duplicative agencies across the spectrum of government. Sometimes more than 100 agencies do the same thing. That's 100 different overheads doing the same thing. Now, if our government was a business, it would be broke. And the truth is that our government is broke and is going to be broke worse. And in fact, we're all seeing the effects in our personal lives. You hear many times that those oil companies are driving up the price of gasoline to $4 now. It's the evil oil companies. I believe that it is exactly opposite. In order to fund the $1.3 trillion deficit that we don't have the revenues to produce, we find that our Federal Reserve is printing money. It is in the printing of money that you devalue the money that is in your pockets at the current moment. If we can create monopoly money out of thin air, then it depreciates the value of what you have in your pocket. If only oil were going up in price, you could maybe make the argument that it's the evil oil companies. Maybe you could say it's the instability in the Middle East. Maybe you could say whatever. But when we see the price of vegetables skyrocketing, when we see the price of gold skyrocketing, the price of silver has gone up almost 30% in the last month. 30%, and you would have to say, well, is there a greater demand for silver? Is there some new manufacturing program that is now using silver that didn't before? That is, did demand drive the price up? And you say, no, silver's not used for one thing today that it wasn't used for a month ago. And when you look at all the prices across the spectrum increasing, you have to acknowledge that the problem is not that companies are driving prices up, but instead the value of the dollar is decreasing. That's because we printed almost $2.6 trillion in money last year. We created it out of thin air. That then depreciates the value of the currency that you have in your pocket in your bank account. And it's that reason that we're seeing inflation begin to skyrocket. The price of gas, food, oil, everything is going up because the money in your pocket is worth less. That's going to continue as long as we do this. Another problem with the country's economy, when it spends more than it can bring in, and when the accumulated debt is so high, our bankers begin to worry, the same as your bankers would worry if you were living this way personally. They would begin to worry that you could pay your house off. They would begin to call you in and speak with you. Our bankers for the United States government have been primarily China, Japan, and U.S. companies buying our Treasury bills. That's the process by which we loan money to the U.S. government. But because of this accumulated position, the Chinese have begun to say, wait, we're not going to buy so much of your treasuries anymore. We're going to decrease our holdings. And so they've begun to sell treasury bills rather than buy them. The Japanese have got their own problems, and so now they're not willing to buy much debt from us. And this year, the largest single private buyer of U.S. Treasury bills said no more. We think the risk is too great that we'll never get paid back. We think the risk is too great that this system is not going to work. So this year right now, our Federal Reserve, which is an arm of the government, which receives its money from the government, is in fact lending money back to the government. So we're giving money to the Federal Reserve. They're turning around and loaning it back to us with the other hand. Now, if you were doing that, your banker would say, well, that's you're having to counterfeit. You're creating a value whereas there's no value, and I think I might call your note. We're in the process of finding that the note is due. We see that the country has a course in front of it that simply discontinues our economy, that simply we fail exactly the way that the Soviet Union economy failed. And we're having discussions on the floor of the House about cutting this from 3.5 to 3.44. This 1.3 would go to 1.24. And we're saying that those cuts are draconian, and I will tell you that we're not even approaching the cuts that need to be made. In these programs alone, Medicare and Medicaid, we're told annually that the fraud, not the waste, but the fraud is about 20%. And yet we can't find it within ourselves here to address that problem. We're afraid of what the ads might look like on TV if we actually began to take this on. I watched 60 Minutes a couple of years ago, and the fraud was discussed by a guy from Florida. He's from Miami. He had been arrested for fraud. He was selling $400,000 worth of medical things to Medicare patients every month. He didn't actually have any inventory. He was just billing the government, and they were paying him $400,000 a month. no inventory. He had a storefront because he said, oh, yeah, those guys from Medicare drive by. They'll see if he had a store. So I had a store, and he said I put my name on the door. But I didn't